Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Imagination to think that they never did. There's a kind of tendency to assume that they didn't quite. Well, similarly, in the Soviet Union, the period of actual faith is now it's in a way it's missed, and it's hard to imagine. I was present at a discussion, a relatively technical discussion amongst historians, where youngish historians working on the number of people who perished in the big hungers in the Ukraine in the 1930s. And after this relatively technical demographic discussion about the figures involved, they switched to motivation. And the historian said, well, you know, I know it's odd. I mean, the various questions, why, for instance, was the border between Ukraine and Belarus closed? There was food in Belarus, there wasn't any in the Ukraine. Was it a deliberate attempt to starve out the Ukrainians and so on? And the historian who was presenting the material said, well, I have a strange theory, you'll find it odd, but I think it was romanticism. I was puzzled, a number of people were puzzled. There's nothing particularly sort of ironic about starvation. He said, well, what I mean by romanticism, they actually believed that collectivization would produce what it was meant to produce, namely a viable, agreeable communities, which at the same time economically effective and so on. They actually believed in this. I know it's odd, but they really believed it. Well, this is the kind of situation that the belief which unquestionably was there and sustained the horror and was sustained by it has now gone, and it takes quite an act of historical imagination to appreciate it, but it's almost totally absent now, and people miss it. The way in this society, there are atheists who get a bit annoyed when they read about bishops who proclaim that they believe in virtually nothing, that they just think it's a sort of formally accompanying ritual with social implications. One likes feeling that even if one doesn't believe, somebody else does, and one can join them if one feels really too frightened. Well, similarly, in the Soviet Union, I'm in a family where both husband and wife had suffered. The husband himself had been in camps, the wife had lost close relatives, and yet they're embarrassed and a bit ill at ease when you get the present atmosphere of total denunciation of what had preceded, which doesn't quite, as I say, quite spell out the full conclusions about the whole system and the whole system of ideas being environment. Keeps this proviso about we still believe in Lenin in the October Revolution and so forth. And the kind of ambiguity is left. The repudiation isn't complete. Well, in the meetings of Memorial, which I attended whenever I could, two things tend to make the discussion lively. One of them is the issue of having a posthumous retroactive trial of Stalin, which has a kind of logic, a suggestion which received unexpected support from a member of the Procuratura, of the prosecution office, who had been involved, and old enough to have been involved in some of these things, and who wrote to the press saying, well, I'm sick and tired of being denounced. It's never been established in court. Let us have a proper trial. And of course, he had a point. Let us have a proper trial with an examination of the critical examination of the evidence and so on. There is a kind of logic about it. My own feeling is that it would be a mistake precisely because of the inseparability of victim and culprit, and to push this mood of kind of collective sense of sin even further can't be desirable. But anyway, that's something for the Russians to decide. The other issue, which tends to be debated hotly, is to what extent the memorial is to be the victims not only of Stalinist repression, but all repression. because this raises the question of how about the people who were repressed and made into victims already in the early 20s. And this, if you press that hard, it rather erases the last bit of secularization, ubiquitous representations of Lenin, and the pretense that something in the beginning was in order. And that again is an issue as yet undecided. Well, as I say, some people hold that because of the untenability of this position, it's best to fudge it. But not all. Now, one of the most interesting people who argue on the other side is the man who actually works for the Central Committee of the party. He's not on the Central Committee, but he's a scholar, rather good one, I think. A scholar working in the Secretariat of the Central Committee, and he attracted attention by a series of very interesting articles, which, if I read them in translation, without attribution of author, I would say, well, this, and I was asked to guess who wrote it. I think, well, it reads to me rather like Raymond Darwin. The argument is roughly, well, Karl Marx profoundly misunderstood industrial society because he concentrated on certain features of the early industrial society and generalized and absolutized them. Unfortunately, our Lenin incorporated these mistakes, and we are in the pickle in which we are, because our whole practice is based on a mistaken theory of industrial society, based on the extrapolation of some early features, and we've got to scrap a lot. Now, for this to come from somebody at the Central Committee, working for the Central Committee is really going a bit far, because it's attracted attention, and he was invited to address the foreign journalists. I was present on this occasion, and he all asked, how can you, working where you do, I mean, how can you say things like that? And don't you get, doesn't anybody object to you doing so? He made light of it. I said, oh, nothing, there's one of my colleagues, one of my colleagues, and I passed him in the corridor and said, well, I wouldn't write things like that. But if you want to, and that's one of the styles of handling the present bizarre situation, the total discontinuity in moral climate between the way things are now and the way they were only 3 years ago, is to make light of it. And he made light of it. At the same time, he was trying to get away from the Secretariat of the Central Committee, not because he had any conscientious qualms about working there, but although there are certain perks, he's got a nomenclatura limousine at his disposal. On the other hand, he's got to keep office hours, and it's a nuisance being an administrator and having to keep office hours, so I sort of sympathise with our predicaments in these matters. And he said, I'm trying to get away from it, and I'm trying to go back to the institute I used to be at, where you don't have to turn up on time and you can get on with your work. And he was quite sure he was going to be able to get back to that institute, so much so that I was acting as an intermediary between him and some people in Britain who want to invite him to a conference. So he said, tell them to write to me at that institute, because I'll be back there very shortly. There's no point in writing me at the Central Committee. Well, I saw him again the day before I left, and he said, nothing doing, they won't let me go. Yakovlev himself, no less, who is on the Central Committee, said, I've got to stay here, and I've got to put up with the limousine and the office hours, and like you, have to do more administration than I enjoy. So I sympathise with him. Anyway, he stayed. Now, I think all this is significant. It could be just accidental, but I think it's not. He makes light of what he's doing, but I assume he's being used as a kite. If he can say these things about the basic, not the perversions of Marx's ideal, but the ideal itself being ill-conceived, misconceived, being based on a wrong theory. If he can say things like that, if he was saying it from an institute, it wouldn't mean very much, because lots of people are saying lots of things. Intellectual activity is very lively in Moscow. If he's saying it from the Central Committee, if he's saying it as the heavens don't fall, and if he's saying it as there is no excessive outcry from the apparatus, then this is an important signal, and I think that they're using him to try to test the temperature. He also told me something which which I'd always worked out for myself, but it's interesting to hear it from somebody who knows the system from the outside. So the danger, of course, is the big mass of the apparat who have no alternative. It's all right for people like me, so I'm properly qualified and I can get a job in an institute anyway, and there are some of us, but there are many people who enter the apparat fairly early who have no particular qualifications, and of course there's no way of bribing them because all their perks are tied to their jobs. You can't tell them, you can keep your money, you can keep your Dutch, and you can keep your car, provided you give a power, because all the things they do have, they have in virtue of their position. I think that's probably the major factor why it's so much harder to liberalize a left-wing dictatorship than a right-wing one, because in the right-wing one, people do have money, and you can tell them you can keep it. One can think of a number of examples of liberalization where that kind of deal was struck. And so that you can't strike it because many of the apparat don't have money as such, and if they do, anyway, it doesn't buy anything. And this is a major, one of the major threats to perestroika. Well, so much for that at the moment. I'll switch to the. I'll go through the various aspects of social life, the economy, the political system, and the ethnic situation in succession. The economy. Now, if the transformation of the moral and intellectual climate has been overwhelming, and anyway, in the major centres, it's rather different in the provinces. In Moscow and the major centres, and of course in the Caucasus and in the Baltic, has been successful. The transformation of the economy has not. This is notorious and widely commented. What has been, in fact, happening in the economy? Well, if you want a simple slogan, as there's been kind of fig leaf capitalism, with rather poor quality fig leaves. Not the best kind of fig leaves, if you know what I mean. And that's just some of the fig leaves which are being used. First of all, the fig leaf of cooperation. The idea is that whilst outright capitalism, the establishment of enterprises where owners of capital employ people who have only their labour to sell, that continues to be prescribed. There's nothing wrong with a number of people getting together and operating independently because it looks all right because they're not exploiting each other. Well, is it? I leave aside the problem that in all kinds of camouflaged ways, a cooperative may in fact be divided into what are de facto employers and de facto employees. But leave that aside. The whole, again, it's a point where the theory doesn't bear careful examination. Marxism concentrates on exploitation at the point where employer meets a person with nothing but his labour to sell, who, because of his weak position, is obliged to sell it at the minimal price, which will make possible his own reproduction, but no better. Marxism wasn't terribly interested in the division of spoils between the capitalists, partly because it believed that most of them would end eliminated and join the army of those who had nothing but labor to sell. And anyway, it didn't matter very much. But obviously, exploitation occurs at that point as well. Some cooperatives will be in a stronger position, or more cunning, or more ruthless, or whatever, and get a better share of the spoils than others. So some cooperatives will again be at the margin of only getting the minimum, enabling making possible their own survival. It's not clear why this should be more. This should be less reprehensible than the situation in which individual labourers are exploited through their economic weakness. But of course, the trouble with the cooperatives isn't that the theory is incoherent, a theory that it doesn't really lend itself to a revival of the economy. The highly capitalized, technically sophisticated units of production don't lend themselves to cooperation. The cooperative movement does, and to a very large extent, I don't have the figures, I'm not sure if anybody does, what the proportions are, but obviously a large proportion of it are simply legalizing the grey economy, the kind of spiv world. What cooperation lends itself to is restaurants, distribution. It merely makes distribution more unequal. It accentuates distribution by liberalizing prices, and it accentuates inequality in consumption by freeing prices in one segment of consumption. It doesn't very much affect production itself, and of course, for that reason, is very highly unpopular. And that's a fig leaf of cooperation, which is neither coherent nor particularly effective. Then there's a fig leaf of joint ventures with outside capital. This is ideologically even more bizarre than the other one, because it doesn't seem to be quite clear, just because foreign technology and foreign capital is involved, exploitation suddenly becomes okay. But of course, somehow or other, it's primitive. It looks to be terribly like the revival in a modern form of the comprador economy. It's like some traditional Asiatic state which controls the economic activities of its own subjects, but permits, grants capitulation and privileges to foreign traders and entrepreneurs whom it thinks to be more or less contained. And of course the trouble with that system is, again, not its ideological incoherence, but the fact that the foreign traders are very much worried both about the political risk, instability, and the trouble of dealing with other people who don't share their own privileges, to whom the capitulations do not extend, and who anyway in their economic practices are not up to the standards to which they're used. And again, it's not said to be unduly successful. The third fig leaf is, of course, the fig leaf of renting land to the peasants and trying to recreate an independent agricultural production. And again, it stops short of something outright, of actually giving it to them. The word is arenda. The renting of land to peasants in the hope that they will produce independently. Now the striking thing is that they're simply not falling over themselves to do so. The days of land hunger, the days when you could start a revolution by offering the peasants land and they're precipitating themselves on it, are gone. Apparently it's widely held the Mujik died during at the time of Khrushchev. There are people about of the Khrushchev generation who bitterly feel if only we'd done it then, it might still have worked. There were still people who knew how to be peasants, who had their ethos, but by now they're gone. And such forays that I've had into the countryside certainly confirm this, and so do reports from more qualified people. One of the top experts on the agrarian classes, who regularly goes to his Ukrainian village, told me, well, what they say is, they drove us into collectivization, let them drive us into perestroika. We can't be bothered to do it ourselves. My general impression is that if a package deal offered them, say free home, 10 acres, plus a small tractor, plus a signed copy of Gorbachev's works, there will be very few takers. They just aren't eager. I've stayed with Belarusian peasants, and they are peasants. They use a horse-pulled plough, but their private plot is large, in which they use this plough. They like it that way. The private plot gives them extra produce for themselves and some to sell, and the colcos provide a kind of overall security, and they're not particularly attracted by the enormous political risk of taking on something new. And I spent somewhat more time in the Georgian Valley, where again they were offered both the animal and pasture, but not at the same time, and they certainly weren't falling over themselves and there was no great enthusiasm for taking it on. The time is gone. The conventional wisdom amongst people who know is the muzhik is dead. If we want agriculture of a private kind, we've got to send several thousands of our young people to America and teach them how to become farmers, Western capitalist farmers. But the muzhik is dead. Well, there it is. The further point about the economy, well, in a way implied in what I've already said, is that the signals are contradictory. This again is linked to this double antithesis. We are repudiating a period of stagnation, with its corruption and its sleaziness, with its corruption. From now I'm going to be honest. Well, is the economic liberalisation a return to some kind of honesty, or is it, on the contrary, making an honest woman of the dishonesty and the double and grey economy of that period? Are we going to have less corruption, or are we, on the contrary, legalising all the previously informal links, the private dealing, wheeling and so on, which went on? It's a kind of confused, the signals are contradictory on this point. It's both a plea for honesty and for liberalising what had been illicit in that period. Well, enough of the economy. The cultural system transformed, the economy not so. Perhaps I should say this about the economy, that the actual material conditions are not nearly as bad as either, I think, the West imagines. I don't know what you imagine, but what I imagine the West imagine. And it's not as bad as they themselves maintain. There's a vast amount of complaining. And the standard Moscow joke is about the 5 contradictions of socialism, which run as follows. Nobody does any work, but the plan is fulfilled. The plan is fulfilled, but there's nothing in the shops. There's nothing in the shops, but the fridge is full. The fridge is full, but we all complain. We all complain, but we sustain the regime. Well, if this is true, which of these contradictions are going to give, I'm not going to predict, but the objective material standard of living is not, in fact, bad. It is bad compared to the West. There's no question of having an enormous range of consumer goods. There's no question of being able to go out to a shop with a shopping list and getting what you want. If you want something specific, you have to mobilize a vast amount of time, energy, your entire network, private knowledge, and so on. And there are Moscow hostesses who take a pride in impressing people with what they have. But this takes a lot of doing. The normal shopping is getting what there happens to be. What there happens to be contains quite edible stuff. I mean, bread is better, of course, than the things of sawdust, of cotton wool, which is normal in the West. Bread, but cheese is perfectly manageable, edible. What is available is not bad, and when it's available, which is about half the time or worse, it's underpriced and it's cheap. The general point is that people are not ill-housed, they're certainly not cold, they're not ill-dressed, they're quite well, they're reasonably well-dressed, reasonably well-housed, provided we don't have more than one child. The only way I can sum up the general economic situation is to use the phrase which John Kenneth Galbraith coined for advanced capitalism, namely private affluence and public squalor. Once you are inside their apartments, you are in a clean, dry, warm place, furniture a bit rickety, but it's not terrible, and certainly in conditions in which one would be perfectly willing to live. The number of people living in communal apartments and having to share kitchen and bathroom and so on is now round about or under 10%. Well, 10% of Moscow is still quite a lot of people, but it is round about 10% or less, and I'm perfectly prepared to believe that the Soviet economy is capable of achieving the ideal of a separate apartment for every family unit within a decade or so. That's not where the trouble lies. The trouble lies in the appallingness of the services, medical services, which I was happy not to have to use, but by all reports are simply appalling. The general squalor and inadequacy of the service, public laboratories are simply unspeakable. And they somehow symbolize, and this, when I say public laboratories, I don't just mean literally public laboratories on the streets. The laboratories in prestigious Academy of Science institutes are fairly terrible. Somehow or other, the director of an institute like that, who can do quite a lot, cannot instruct the cleaners to maintain these places at a level which would be acceptable by Western standards, or which the Soviet citizens impose in their own homes. In their own homes, although the size, let's say, certainly the variety of produce, etc., isn't up to Western standards, it's very, very good compared to the past, and it's good by kind of absolute standard. It's not there that the shoe pinches. It's a public squalor, the harassment by bureaucracy, and various features like that which make life unacceptable, not only to somebody used to Western standards, but also to them. But at the material level, my guess is that the material level they have is about the standard which is appropriate and which may have to be adopted by the 21st century in the interest of ecological restraint. But that's just my belief. But it's not there that the things are unacceptable. What is true, of course, is they are embourgeoised in the sense that they like privacy, and that if you have those tastes, you can no longer, in those apartments, you can't have more than one child. The peasants are still peasants. When I stayed with the Belarusian peasants, basically the house, though it could have been divided into separate units, was kind of one acoustic, unseparated unit, with the master having a bigger bed separate, and the rest of it separated with most by partitions, and they don't mind. But their offspring are no longer peasants, and they want their rooms to themselves, and they can only have that if the family isn't very large. The political system. Now, the political system basically has three pillars. They're the formal constitution, which always was admirably democratic, accountable government, and so on. Secondly, they're the de facto concentration of power in the party, which is itself the one from the beginning, but is itself enshrined in the constitution, which recognizes a special role of the party in society. Now, to Westerners, the coexistence of these two features looks like a contradiction. It isn't a kind of piece of hypocrisy. How can they maintain both? It isn't, because there's a third pillar which makes the whole system coherent. It makes it valid, makes it coherent. And the third pillar is an overall theory of society. As Raymond Aron used to say, this is an idiocracy. And of course, the overall theory maintained that the truth about historical development and the final fulfillment and liberation of man and the attainment of society which is both affluent and devoid of coercion. The plan which leads to this is known, and history will implement it. And it so happens that the plan requires its own implementation by the disciplined advance guard of the proletariat, which in turn is the agent of the completion of this plan, and so on. So the third pillar makes the other two logically coherent, whether you accept the overall theory or not. There's no quip of Bertolt Brecht's about saying in a democracy, if things go badly, you change the government, but in a dictatorship, you change the people. You can't actually change the people. You can diminish their number, sometimes quite significantly, but you can't actually replace it. But what is true is that you can, of course, change the effective segment of the people self-co-opting, a solitary association in which power is concentrated, and this is how the system works. It enabled the system to uphold simultaneously two illusions which were part of it. One, the illusion, the Leninist illusion of factionlessness within the party, the kind of united homogeneous body. And the second illusion is that Marxism is a body of propositions such that, faced with any concrete political historical problem, a unique answer can be extracted from it. And anybody who doesn't come to that answer must be either bad Marxist or up to no good, or probably both. But the truth of the matter, of course, is that the party can only work like any other body by having factions in it which compete and struggle with each other. Otherwise, and if it really were a simple, unstructured association of sincere believers, it would be far too volatile at the mercy of any sort of persuasive crank, which it isn't. And it does in fact have factions, and of course equally it isn't true that Marxism is a consistent, coherent body of propositions which yields a unique solution, like some mathematical theory, when faced with a problem. It does nothing of the institution. Mix and change the extra. It has taken this out of the cupboard and shaken the dust out of it and actually started implementing it. It's been unused for so long, the whole thing was extremely comic because nobody knew what the rules were. In the days when this was simply a kind of cosmetic piece of theatre, nobody minded. I mean, what they refer to the administrative command system applied in the polity as much as in the economy. People just did what they were told, and nobody queried it. But now suddenly, this unused piece of machinery was put to work, but nobody knew what the rules were. So the rules had to be invented and manipulated ad hoc as a system was being put into operation. And nobody knew what the rules were. It was very strange when the really big event was this assembly of delegates in last week of May and the first week of June. The delegates, first of all, there was utmost obscurity about the electoral procedure. It's very, very complicated. What people don't realize is a very strong corporatist element in it. You have the first body of approximately 2,400 people is made up of three categories of delegates. First of all, the simplest and most intelligible are territorial constituencies of roughly equal size. But then there are also ethnic constituencies, and they get very complicated. Because on the one hand, of course, those favour the smaller ethnic republics against the greater ones, but then the greater ones get again more members because of the autonomous zones and sub-regions in them. So you get a very complicated setup. And the third category are representatives of social institutions, the kind of corporatist principle. So the Communist Party doesn't merely stand for election, it also is a social institution which as such sends delegates. There's a kind of very institutions such as, needless to say, trade unions, but also the Academy of Sciences. And somebody worked out that the plural voting is quite remarkable. Theoretically, you could have quite a number of votes. I mean, as an academician, as a member of a trade union, as a member of an ethnic group, as a sort of resident in a given territorial unit, and so on. It gets very, very complicated. And it combines the electoral system in individual institutions as well as the national scale, combines kind of proportional representation, that's the kind of total number of votes, with constituency principles, and the additional principle that no one can be elected unless he has 50% of the votes, which has the interesting effect that as long as you control, you can block anybody, provided you control 50% of the votes, anybody can be blocked. It didn't quite work because a number of people were blocked, popular but dangerous people were blocked, but then there was such an outcry, other people offered to resign their positions to enable them to get in, that the authorities compromised and gave in. It was very, very complicated, and literally nobody knew the rules. When this great Congress, and then of course you have the second stage, out of these 2,400, whatever it is, larger than that, two houses, the House of Deputies and the House of Nationalities, are elected, which then tended to jointly, but nobody quite knew how they were going to be selected out of the total number. It's a kind of internal procedure which provides a further sieve. And all this had to be decided on the spot. Before the Congress assembled, there was a pervasive rumour in Moscow that it would only last 3 days, that the party members had been instructed to keep it short and sweet before much damage is done, and to dissolve themselves within 3 days. This rumour proved to be quite incorrect. Then there was a second rumour that nobody knew from day to day when it was going to end. That it would end after 2 weeks because Gorbachev didn't want to miss his trip to West Germany. And this turned out to be correct. It did end after 2 weeks, but it did quite a lot. In between. And the result is a very curious kind of presidential parliament, because first of all, of course, they had to elect the president, and somebody deliberately stood, somebody with a fine aristocratic name of Obolensky, stood against Gorbachev, not because they expected to succeed, but just to establish the principle that the thing is elected. And then you had this, Gorbachev's running of it had that kind of Harun al-Rashid quality, that he bypassed procedure when it suited him in a kind of populist way. He likes addressing people in the second person singular, and he's familiar with people, and he oscillated between legalism and a kind of asserting the principle of the sovereignty of Gorbachev in Parliament. The legalism would come out when he would say things like, "Well, can we do this? We don't want to commit a folly. Is there a lawyer in the house?" Well, of course, the place is full of lawyers. The one who was concerned, "Is this legal?" Well, he said it wasn't. And then there were further contribution discussions. In the end, they did it anyway. So there was kind of insistence on legalism. On the other hand, at other times, he would say, "Well, we are the sovereign body. We can decide what we like. There's nobody higher than us." I.e., not the party. The sovereign body is this assembly. So he oscillated between this, our sovereignty as a collectivity, and the respect for legalism. And as a result was a kind of curious situation where the head of government was at the same time the speaker. Well, was it particularly democratic? Well, it wasn't, of course. Partly because quite a lot of the constituencies were not contested, and the number of liberals, like progressive or whatever question-begging word you wish to use, can be assessed something between 400 to 800. They remain a minority, and they could always be outvoted by the swamp and mafia. The swamp is a way of referring to the Russian backwoods, where elections frequently were not contested, which continued to be under the orders of the old patronage network. And the mafia, of course, is a way of referring, one might call the Muslim Mezzogiorno, the areas of above all, Central Asia and others, which again haven't shifted the system, but haven't changed their political style. But what remains the case, that the 400 to 800 of Moscow, Leningrad, other big town delegates, originally the Moscow group, but now called the interregional group, in alliance with the liberal nationalists of the Baltic and the Caucasus, could certainly make themselves heard, and certainly couldn't be defied. And the present system is some kind of compromise between the liberal stroke ethnic alliance, kind of compromise between them and what is very suggestively described as the swamp and mafia. One of the latest outbursts by one of the liberals, I think it was Afanasyev, the historian, before I left, was the kind of request, can Gorbachev, can Michael Sergeyevich make up his mind whether he's going to run with the hares or with the hounds? I don't know whether he meant it or not, but of course the essence of the situation, if I understand it, is precisely that this ambiguity must be maintained, that the success of the whole operation depends on both the hares and the hounds considering Gorbachev the best they can get out of the present situation. If you really identified with one side or the other, as far as I can see, it would be disastrous. And the skill which he has is to play both ways. Well, to sum up the description of the political system, the three pillars have been radically transformed. The first pillar, which had been cosmetic, is now operational, though not completely so. The third pillar, the idiocracy, the theory of society which made the other two compatible, has had a great load taken off it. The theory is no longer taken very seriously, and certainly can be defied, which you couldn't be in the past. And the middle pillar, the party, well, it's there. It's partly demoralized. On the other hand, it continues to have a very essential function. The central apparat, there's only really one apparat, the state, party and economic apparat, continues to be the only effective hierarchy in the society. There are, of course, no end of association, these famous, the informal ones, as I call it, Social Democratic Union, this, that, and the other. On the whole, they're intellectual clubs with no very convincing popular support. The right-wing ones, of course, are a different matter. There nobody knows how much support they would get in the crisis. The only kind of association which can rapidly generate a real grassroots support and be a countervailing force are, of course, the national ones. That has been done, and that does exist. But then in between the central apparatus, which continues to exist, somewhat demoralized, somewhat dubious, deprived of the ideocratic support on the one hand, and threatened by the rivalry of the previously purely cosmetic pillar on the other side, its position has been undermined, but it's still there, and it's the agency through which perestroika is still being carried out. If you like, the paradox of the situation is, if I'm right in saying that the theory can't be made coherent, glasnost depends on not having too much of it. End of counter-personality depends on Michael Sergeyevich's charisma. And the establishment of a plural society depends on the strength of the party. I did a little bit of field work on the party, which on the whole, in the sense, on one occasion I went by mistake into a closed party meeting. And my general field work method was simply to go to all meetings that I heard about and see what they say to each other. And when I saw an open door and behind it the meeting was obviously going on, and I didn't have any appointment to go to, I went in. And I saw people looking at me, strange. But it took about 5 minutes before they shooed me out and told me this is a closed party meeting. These 5 minutes were long enough to get a clear impression of, well, first of all, they all had suits. You can tell party members they wear suits and ties. Other intellectuals in Soviet Union, as in Cambridge, don't always listen. But party members tend to wear suits and ties. They are not young, and they are kind of terribly, there's an air of well-meaningness and moralism about it. And this impression was somewhat confirmed. I also went to open meetings. When people are being admitted to the party, that's an open meeting. And those, of course, I was entitled to attend and attended. And there again, the people who were being admitted had sort of public testimonials given to them, and they all had impeccable characters. I mean, they were all very good at their work, and they were very good in their families, they were very good with their friends, and it went on like this. And I'm not unaware of the fact that but there's an element of this that, of course, also, it both ratifies your career and helps it when you get into the party. And the fear sometimes expressed in the West, the present perestroika, just a kind of feint, and as soon as it succeeds in disarming the West and getting economically stronger, it will resume its push towards world domination. It's very hard to, I mean, the moralism of these meetings was very striking. I always expected the candidates for party membership would take some kind of oath that henceforth they won't smoke or drink or womanize. The idea that this association of Rotarians, careerists, and small-town mafiosi, known as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Bolshevik, is a dangerous conspiracy aiming at world domination, seems to me at present highly implausible. They're demoralized. They can barely cope. They can't really cope with less than 1 million Estonians, and they can only just cope, astonishingly, with 70,000 Abkhazians, and they really don't want to take on Western Europe, which is full of people like Estonians, only worse. I'm not suggesting that the West should divide, but they don't strike me as wishing to take on any more than they've got on their plate, as it is. Right. Moral regeneration, economy, polity. Perhaps the next thing I should deal with is the dread ethnic situation. And the two real threats, of course, hanging over the self-transformation is economic failure and ethnic explosion. I mean, the worst possible scenario, of course, is complete economic stagnation and total ethnic explosion, and the optimum one, of course, would be containing of the ethnics and economic success. And there are two possibilities in between, which you can work out for yourself. Four possibilities. Well, I think the ethnic situation can best be approached by a historical summary of what has happened in southeastern Europe in the past, well, it's nearly 2 centuries, not quite yet, but in the period since the Napoleonic Wars. The whole of Eastern and Southeastern Europe after the Napoleonic Wars was divided between 3 empires, none of which can be described as ethnic states, even if they had a dominant ethnic group and dominant language, and each of which was based, if anything, on an ideology. Sunni Islam, counter-Reformation Catholicism, and Orthodoxy, respectively. Each of them incorporated in a society, in an imperial society based on this kind of religious validation, an enormous patchwork of ethnic groups, partly with a very, very complicated kind of pointiest ethnographic map, and partly it wasn't even drawn on the map at all, because some of the groups were divided horizontally by occupational specialization rather than by territory. During the 19th century, I'm not going to sort of go through my entire theory of nationalism, but the shift from a stable agrarian society, from people living behind the plough to people working not physically but semantically and being in an occupational mobile structure where they had to communicate with each other, led people to concentrate on their culture because it was the medium in which they lived. In their work, in their dealing with the now pervasive bureaucracy, this really made you what you were. So they became conscious of the culture which previously they ignored. And this, of course, happened throughout this territory. The consequence was that by the time the 19th century came to an end with the First World War, 5 buffer states existed between two of these empires, and nationalist sentiment was pervasive throughout. Well, all three empires, although they were on different sides of the Second War, all ended defeated and crushed in the war, and two of them fell apart into national states full of discontents because they, for obvious reasons, it wasn't possible to draw the boundaries in such a way that the nationalist principle, one state, one ethnic group, should be observed. And this was then corrected by the various methods, assimilation, forcible transplantation, and genocide, in such a way that the adjustment of the political map to the ethnographic map, or rather the other way around, was far greater than less than complete in the territories of two of those empires by about 1948. Genocide started early, but it was in under cover of the Second World War. It was easier to practice it, and in the period of retaliation immediately after, forcible transplantation was also possible. Now, the irony is that the fate of one of the three empires was unlike the other two. First of all, where the other two collapsed and were replaced by national states. The third one, revived by about 1920, under totally new political and ideological management, and became a new secular ideology with, and I stress, very powerful faith. Faith strong enough then to suppress the ethnic movement on their territory as long as that faith was strong enough, which it now is not. Fact number one. Fact number two, ironically, the third of these three empires didn't benefit sufficiently from Hitler's and Stalin's crimes. Though they committed plenty of them on the territory of the Soviet Union, they didn't really tidy it up ethnically the way they, between them, they tidied up certain other areas, like Poland or the western half of Czechoslovakia. I mean, Stalin's crimes in the Soviet Union merely shifted the ethnic map. He moved people from one place to another, but didn't tie them up. Well, the consequence is that both the blow-up of the empire and the adjustment of the succession national state by genocide and forcible transplantation, which had happened in the other two areas, didn't happen in the Soviet Union. But when the lid was taken off by perestroika, this has been this process, which had been delayed, is now on the verge of happening. I'm not going to predict how far it will go and how it will happen there. There's a large number of paradoxes about it. I'll give you, let's say, three models, each drawn, three examples, each drawn from an area in effect I visited, and one way or another had reasonably intimate contact. Belarusia is an example of a society which rather resembles Poland or the western part of Czechoslovakia, and that the ethnic situation had been tidied up. Hitler killed the Jews, Stalin expelled the Poles, and the Belarusians, with of course the Russian minority, are left, but the nationalism is fairly muted. Belarusian parents still quite often send their children to Russian schools because of the obvious advantage. Nationalism is an intellectuals, literary movement, largely. The peasants are not virulent, the peasants are stablers. Remember the Polish period rather affectionately, without any resentment. The Belarusian Jewish relationship doesn't have the bitterness which the Ukrainian Jewish one had. The memorial at the place of execution in Minsk had an inscription in Hebrew letters, whereas the memorial at Babi Yar in Kiev does not, and causes great offence. First of all, it's very ostentatiously Babi Yar one, but secondly, there's nothing on it that conveys the fact that the victims were Jewish. Belarusia is an area which is relatively muted nationalism, and incidentally, you can play this sort of nationalist regression, like there's occurring decimal onward, because within Belarusia, there are again linguistic dialectal minorities, Polishchuks and one other, who again differ linguistically from Belarusian, the way Belarusians differ from Russian. And you could go on subdividing like that if you wanted it, for a long time. But that is one important part. A different model of the ethnic tension is Georgia. Now, Georgia is, like the Soviet Union as a whole, is a model of a society which hasn't benefited from the, as I say, from Hitler's and Stalin's crimes, where the ethnic patchwork is totally unmanageable, large number of minorities, very, very intense feeling, and the situation is virtually insolvable. The various rival principles, as in the case, of course, of the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, the various rival principles which can be invoked cannot be brought into harmony. You can have a simple democratic principle that in any given area the majority should decide and that culture should be allowed to establish its own educational and other institutions. But that's in conflict with another, of course, not insignificant principle of geographic compactness, viability, historic continuity, and also what I call there's also the pig and potato principle, that the area in which an ethnic group graze pigs or grew potatoes enters into it so more so than an area in which they produce pig iron or produce computers. Now, it's an odd principle, because I mean, the industrial workers are human beings like anybody else, and they too are entitled to love the area in which they live and work and play. But nevertheless, the pig and potato principle is very strong. As for the argument is that industrial populations can be moved very easily, and have been moved very easily. And once you start simply applying present demographic composition, you deprive many ethnic groups of significant parts of their historic homelands, and some of them, of course, cease to be a majority anywhere, and some of them never were a majority anywhere. And the conflict of these various principles, the superiority of links wrought in the Agrarian Age as opposed to links merely established in the course of industrial migration, the need for any ethnic group to have its political roof over them, continuity, geographic compactness, and majority. By the time you have all these principles, you cannot satisfy them all. And of course, all ethnic groups invoke the principle which happens to favour them. And there is no way from the centre of reconciling them, and the feelings are overwhelmingly strong. In Moscow, of course, there are a lot of people who try and work out solutions for this, and there's a kind of spectrum from what you might call the universalistic individualists, who say, well, ethnicity should be a private matter. One would put it to be, my nationality is my business. It shouldn't be on my passport. What we ought to have is universalistic, it's quite an attractive idea, universalistic political institutions, and within them, as for their culture and ethnic self-identification, everybody should choose instead of having it imposed on them, where at the moment it's imposed on people. At the moment you can only choose the ethnic group of one of your parents if they're different, or of course if they're the same then you have no choice at all. That's one ideal. The other ideal, of course, is the kind of culturalist pluralism, which concentrates not on the rights of individuals, but on the rights of cultures. And both these positions are represented amongst the very active intellectuals in Moscow who with goodwill try to do something about the ethnic problem. Interesting thing is in Georgia, where I spent some time, both these extremes are heartily detested and distrusted. They say roughly, let the Russians practice universalistic individualism or cultural pluralism in their own republic. They can do with both, but let them not come and interfere in our situation, which they don't understand. And of course, either of these principles, if applied in the incredibly complex patchwork of the Caucasus, will result either in subjection of the groups to a centralized society, or in its breakup, in its fragmentation. And the Georgians, amongst others, are determined to oppose both. Well, that's the second model, of a much less benign. The Caucasian model is much less benign than the Belarusian one. Take another example, Estonians. Now, the Estonians have not, like the Georgians or the Soviet Union as a whole, inherited an unmanageable ethnic patchwork from the past. In the past, they were a plural society, but the ruling stratum of Teutonic or Swedish gentry and nobility or burghers was almost entirely left. There were a very small number of Swedes left. The Swedes actually left by agreement between Hitler and the Swedes. The Germans left at the time of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So you've got a homogeneous, the non-historic nation with a very whose national consciousness, unlike the Georgian, was not so sustained by this kind of the Georgians used the Durkheimian method of never eating or drinking, and they do both a lot without reaffirming their social relationships. So the kind of ethnic, the culture is a medium by which an ethnic consciousness is sustained so vigorously that although Georgia has been under Soviet power for 70 years, it really feels like those areas which have only been under Soviet power for 40 years. And makes 40 and 70 makes quite a different social memory. Well, Estonia is not like that. The ethnic consciousness is sustained by the standard apparatus, Eastern European apparatus for non-historic nations, namely the National Theatre, National Museum. The Ethnographic Museum has one object for every 10 Estonians, and less than a million, and then in the cellars and cupboards of the museum. It works very well. Well, they're human beings too, and they're entitled to the votes. The Estonians propose all kinds of electoral reforms. The underlying purpose is simply to deprive as many Russians as possible of the vote. Again, what you do, forcibly transplant them, as you can't do that. You could do that in period 45 to 48, but it's not very easy to do it now. Well, these are the three models. There are other models still. My impression of Central Asia is that they are still, the political system is not one dominated by a modern, spontaneous ethnic nationalism, but by the local patronage networks. A striking example of this is the major massacre which occurred in the case of summer of the Meskhetian Turks, which is an interesting event because it's not one of these historically hallowed hatreds that between Azerbaijanis, who are in fact Turks, and the Armenians. So the Meskhetians were only transported there by Stalin at the time when you think of invading Turkey and didn't wish to be embarrassed by Turks living on the Georgian-Turkish border. They haven't been there very long. They are Sunni Muslims, like the Uzbeks who surrounded them and who massacred them. Why should this have happened? Well, I spoke about this to a Soviet ethnographer who's spent a great deal of time doing fieldwork in Central Asia, and who presumably knows it as well as anybody. And his theory was simple, that in the present conflict between the liberalizers and moralizers at the center and the mafia, which in fact dominates Central Asia, and all Russians are convinced that this is so, the mafia had to display its muscle. And the only way it could do so is to show what it could do. Well, whom were they to massacre? If they did nasty things to Tajiks, with whom they have some quarrels, the Tajiks will do the same to Uzbeks in Tajikistan, so that's not on. If they do it to minorities such as Russians or Greeks or Jews or Armenians who have friends outside, this is undesirable. Meskhetians are ideal. They don't have any friends outside because the Georgians don't want them back, because they don't want to tilt the balance, the Christian-Muslim balance in Georgia. So they're an ideal object for a demonstration of power. I don't know whether the theory is true, but it has an enormous amount of plausibility. So that the Central Asian ethnic pattern is again different from the models I described for the other three ideal types. I could go on, but I won't.